I'm Sharon Kelly, and the title of my exhibition is Red to Red. It's a body of work that is really the outcome of a fellowship at the British School at Rome, which actually ended up in two parts because I was originally awarded the fellowship in 2020. So I went to Rome in January 2020, but obviously with the pandemic and Italy being very seriously affected by the pandemic in the early days, the fellowship was halted and I had to return to Ireland. So 3 years later, I've come back, or I went back to complete the fellowship. So the work that you see in the exhibition is actually work that was made between sort of mid-January and mid-March this year. So whilst in Rome, my research interest was really around the body and in particular the human anatomy collections that are housed in Naples, Bologna, Florence, and some kind of medical collections in Rome. However, on my returning period in Rome, I kind of took the approach of wanting to really absorb the resonances of being in Rome, and it kind of expanded the, I suppose, the field of vision for me in terms of the work. I became very sort of fixated, I suppose, with the colour red, and it wasn't an intentional strategy from the outset because I kind of started at the beginning of the residency to just play around with red ink and red paint, and then kind of thought, well, this is actually interesting because there is so much to see and so much to absorb somewhere like Rome with so much history, and it becomes quite overwhelming. So to impose a kind of restriction on your approach can sometimes be an interesting strategy and quite a challenge. So I decided then I would explore red in relation to the interest that I already had, which was around the body, depictions of textile that you might see in historical art collections, the use of red in statues, Etruscan frescoes, and so on. So it started to become, a kind of embracing strategy for the work. There is a particular interest in the fragmented body or the fractured body, and I suppose there's so many echoes of fractured statues, fractured monuments, houses, whatever, Rome is full of layers of history and fractured sediments and so on and so on. And so the interest for me, I suppose, is around the idea that the body, in a sense, in being disassembled and reassembled, is kind of like a transformation of sorts. And I suppose there's a link and a resonance with the idea of healing and body parts, and in the notion of things like the ex-votos, where sort of pieces of body parts would be fashioned and given, you know, in thank for healing. And they'd be very specific, so it could be the heart, it could be the leg, or whatever. So they'd just be these fractured objects that also when you see those, as I noticed in collections in the museums in Rome, you'd see these particular objects, and they're, in a sense, they're mute objects, but they're also, they have this kind of strange agency and power. And so I think a lot of the work that you see in the exhibition is informed, you know, a lot, very much by those encounters with fractured statues, you know, fragments of frescoes, halted gestures that you see, and the ex-photo objects. I think the idea of illness and the body, or the body under stress or trauma or burden, is kind of, you know, is interesting because it's not just a physical thing. It affects the mind and the body. And in the state of illness or severe fragility, you know, there's a transformation of sorts, in the same way that going through an illness and in a period of recovery, you're also going through transition. So I think the you know, for me, the working through of the work in Rome was like a kind of, you know, a journey of transition, you know, going through Rome, being in Rome, and you know, bringing along with me all those things that have been experienced in the past and have been, I suppose, responded to or engaged with in my own art practice. So one of the other things that informs the understanding of the body or how the body and mind work is my own experience of running, and also not only that, but also bodies of work that I have made in the recent past, where I've worked with athletes, runners, I've worked with boxers, and really exploring that idea of mind-body synergy, and also the idea of resilience. So where you're worn down, and you build back up again. And I think there is an element of that sort of focus within the work in the Red to Red exhibition. So in the exhibition you'll see you know, a series of two-dimensional works, but also three-dimensional works, or works that go from floor to ceiling. And it was interesting for me to, in creating the works, that I was using materials that are quite humble, because I was quite struck, you know, by the splendour of Rome and the grandeur of some of the places that I went to, but also, you know, I was acknowledging in a way the humbleness of humanity, and you know, the scenes of kind of homelessness and poverty that I did see. And I wanted to use materials that had a history in a way. So these, the use of kind of flattened out cardboard boxes that have been used for something else and probably were recycled materials anyway, were being discarded, you know, in the recycling capacity at the British schools. So I was using those materials, and also these offcuts of kind of furniture or architectural angles and arcs, which were being discarded also at the BSR, and were there for the taking. So, you know, so I kind of subsumed those into the work that I made. I think you know, the use of certain materials, like, for example, the rubber glove. I mean, some of these encounters come about a wee bit by accident, in that I was dyeing some of the scrim with red paint, and I peeled my glove off and saw the inside of it and immediately saw a sculpture. So, you know, so things like that, you know, where I'm actually reusing the things, you know, the tools that I've used to create the work, you know, to me is like another kind of renewal or transformation. So things like that, you know, I was quite excited about, and also then the use of like sporting supports, like the cohesive bandage to sturdy something, or to, you know, to hold it steady, and the use of boxer hand wrap that, you know, keeps the you know, the wooden boot form stable against its support. So that would have been informed by previous boxing encounters, and yeah, so I'm kind of excited. I was very excited in the making of those works that you know, utilized a variety of materials, but had very specific resonances, you know, personally for me, and also as threads that were being drawn from previous bodies of work. What's interesting about the sunken gallery, you know, that going down into a different layer or a different level, is really, I suppose, conducive to the work, because you know, I managed in Rome to visit a number of sites where, you know, say for example, the ground level of a basilica would have a particular access for visiting the basement or the underground sort of crypts and catacombs. And it was interesting to learn that some of these sites above level, even though they were nowhere near the Vatican, above level they operated under the Italian state laws, but underground they operated under Vatican rules and regulations. So that idea of transitioning into a different space was quite appealing to me, you know, within the context of the work, where you're, you know, dealing with lots of different levels of resonances, not only within the use of the colour red and its symbolism and so on, but also in the use of materials, the subject matter, the context.